to be able to advance a strategy which will help to solve, and none of us, of course, have got any magic answers, but at least which, as far as possible, taking cognizance of the reality, will help to be able to solve the problems, extremely complex problems, of socialist advance. The last time that I debated with Ernest Mandel in 1969, the transcript of his speech was published by various Trotskyist organizations, so I'm able to have it in front of me. Comrade Mandel said, "Why do thousands and thousands of people flock to the Trotskyist banner on a world scale, and why do the Soviet bureaucrats and Monty Johnstone, their British spokesman, have to reopen a debate which they hoped had been finished with machine gun bullets 30 or 35 years ago in the period of the infamous Moscow trials?" Well, as a matter of fact, I wasn't very good in 1936 and 7 at wielding a machine gun, nor, in fact, do I think that it is going to be quite as possible now seriously to proclaim that speakers from the Communist Party are agents of Moscow. But more particularly, what I would suggest at the outset is that the very premises on which Ernest Mandel was speaking then and the Fourth International was basing itself, namely that the Trotskyist movement was growing and the communist movement was being overtaken as some kind of counter-revolutionary force which hadn't got any credence in the eyes of the workers after the events of May-June in France in '68 and the hot Italian autumn in 1969, has in fact totally been refuted by the experience of the last 9 years. The new vanguard, as they called it, and Ernest Mandel made a big play about it in the debate which we had at that time, the so-called new vanguard that they posited at that time has failed to produce the desired results, and that strategy has had to be replaced by another one which is more geared to a recognition that the traditional organizations of the labor movement cannot be quite as easily pushed into the background as was thought then. In France, where their candidate, Krivine, in 1969, standing, as he put it, to represent the ideas of the May and June events, as conceived by the Trotskyists, or a section of the Trotskyists who took part in them, came bottom of the poll with 239,000 votes, 1.2%, but far from increasing that position when Krivine stood again in 1974, his vote fell to 94,000 to 0.36%, in other words, a third of 1% of the poll, hardly bearing out the rather grandiloquent perspectives that were being put forward by the Fourth International at that time. In Italy, after the hot autumn of 1969, with the revolutionary implications that were stressed by Mandel and the Fourth International, I learned from a recent article in Socialist Challenge that the Fourth International organization, which frankly was never strong, virtually collapsed altogether. In neither of those two countries, let alone in any other, have the Trotskyists or any grouping of the still divided, internecine fighting Trotskyists succeeded in making any headway at all. However, the communist parties in these countries, written off again and again by Trotsky and by the Fourth International, have helped in the period since we last debated in 1969 to transform the situation in those two countries. In France, where since 1972 left unity has developed among the common governmental program that the Communist Party had been seeking with the socialists for many years beforehand, has led to a position where now the public opinion polls predict that the left will get a 54% or so majority in the elections which are due to take place at the end of March and the beginning of April. In Italy, in the last general elections that were held last year, the Communist Party, with over 34% of the votes, obtained not only the largest communist vote in Italian history, but the largest communist vote that has ever been obtained in Western Europe. And not only that, but the policies advanced by the Italian Communist Party have helped to break the stranglehold that Christian democracy had been holding over Italy for over a quarter of a century, in the sense of giving a perspective of social transformations in this country, which I'll be looking at in more detail in a moment. In Spain, after 40 years or so nearly of fascism, the Communist Party, emerging from the underground, has established its leading position in the trade unions of the country, in the workers' movement, and although in the elections its vote was only just under 10%, is nonetheless again an important force in the public life of the country. In Britain, although of course we are unable to speak of any similar types of developments which could rejoice the hearts of revolutionary socialists, because we are in a country which is dominated still by social democracy, one thing has been shown very clearly, and that is that the perspectives of the Trotskyists with regard to the main labour movement in this country have proved to be totally and completely false. Tariq Ali was writing in his book on the coming British Revolution at that time as follows. He wrote, "The Labour Party is a corpse," and he went on to say, "The Labour Party is totally bureaucratised, and the only organisation which revolutionaries, the only orientation which revolutionaries can have to it is to devise a strategy for destroying it, which means, in effect, breaking its links with the trade union movement." Fortunately, the IMG has had to revise that particular strategy, which, like so many other strategies of the Fourth International and its organisations, was based on an irresponsible estimate, entirely impressionistic and superficial estimate of the main forces of the working class. The Trotskyist perspectives of revolution, either immediately around the corner or in some cases already there, have been disproved again and again, and yet the Trotskyists and the Fourth International that is represented by Ernest Mandel persist in the same cataclysmic picture of revolution, the same fundamental model for Western Europe as was successful under totally different historic conditions in the Soviet Union in Russia in 1917, without apparently asking themselves why, in fact, their proposals never succeed, why these policies that they put forward, which Trotsky predicted in 1938 when the Fourth International was formed, were going to bring millions to its banner. The Fourth International was going to, and you can read the transitional program, which is still the only program that the Trotskyists have. The Fourth International was alone going to lead the overthrow of Hitler and Mussolini, lead the colonial revolution, lead the proletarian revolution. And we should ask ourselves, if we're realistic, and the comrades of the Fourth International should ask themselves, because there's never been a serious, fundamental, self-critical analysis, perhaps we'll get it from Ernest Mandel this evening, I'm looking forward to it, why it is that they've never succeeded. Trotsky said on the eve of the Second World War, the opportunities, objectively, for the forces of the Fourth International are greater today than they were for the Bolsheviks in the First World War. If that is so, why is it that nowhere in the world, and particularly, of course, in Western Europe, which we're debating this evening, have the Trotskyists ever succeeded in developing a movement which has seriously had a mass basis. The only places in the world that they have done, they have collapsed. In Ceylon, where the main Trotskyist organization was expelled as for engaging in the heinous crime of popular frontism, and in Argentina and Bolivia, debacles also from an official Trotskyist point of view. But as far as we're concerned, if the perspectives, the strategy, the analysis advanced by the Fourth International for Western Europe were to be realistic, why is it that the Trotskyists have been totally unable in any country to develop a credible organization in the way that the communists have been able to do in countries like France and Italy in the most spectacular form, but of course in other countries like Britain and the rest of it, still far in excess of the Trotskyist forces? I would argue that above all, it is because there is no basic correctness in the Trotskyist analysis of an insurrectionary road for the countries of Western Europe. It is completely foolish to assume that because under the circumstances which the revolution succeeded in Russia in 1917, with dual power, Soviets, workers' councils and so on, that this is the road which will succeed in developed industrial countries of Western Europe, in which the working class has not only built up its organizations to a very considerable extent over a very long period of time, but has been successful over a large and long historical period in winning democratic rights in the representative bodies of the country. And this, therefore, means that whereas in Russia, in 1905, Soviets came into existence, and again after the February Revolution in 1917, because there were at that time no proper representative bodies in which the working class could be represented, and therefore they created their own Soviets as an alternative to the old organs of state power. In countries like Britain and France and Italy and so on, it is stupid to think that you can bypass these organs which the working class movement in this country, for instance, right from Chartist days, with the full support of Marx and Engels, who saw it as a revolutionary movement in its implications, fought for and won for universal suffrage. It was Karl Marx in 1980, a couple of miles down the road, who dictated to Jules Guesde, the leader of the French Workers' Party in 1880, the preamble of that party's program, in which he formulated the conception of the transforming of universal suffrage from a means of deception, as he put it, into a means of emancipation for the working class. Now, when communist parties in Western European countries speak about a perspective of winning a majority in these representative institutions in which the workers have won the right to vote and the working people have the opportunity of registering a majority, we don't do so because we have become social democrats who see it's just as a question of winning a parliamentary majority and then taking over the state apparatus which will govern on behalf of the working class in the same way as it works and governs on behalf of the ruling class. If you read the British Road to Socialism draft, you read the recent publications like the Communiste et l'État, which the French communists have published, and the rest of them, you will see that the communists in all the Western European countries remain true to the basic Marxist proposition that the state is an organ of class power and that it needs to be transformed into a totally different type of state, both from the point of view of its personnel and from the point of view of its structures, if it is going to be responsive to the will of the people and to build socialism. However, of course, Ernest, Mandel and the others will say this is a social democratic point of view because Marx in the 18th Brumaire and Lenin following him in State and Revolution rejected transforming the state apparatus in favor of breaking the state apparatus. This is very good, but if you read, for instance, Engels writing to Bernstein, you will see that he uses the term umformen, which means in German to transform the state apparatus. Marx and Engels didn't make this fine distinction, didn't lay down these dogmas that you can only do it A or only do it B, in the same way as Marx in 1872 at Amsterdam, following the conference of the First International, talked about the possibility of a peaceful transition to socialism in certain countries. He mentioned Britain and America, and said possibly, if he knew more about it, Holland, in accordance with its institutions. The point being, not that because Marx said that then it's valid now, but simply I want to make the point that to rely on this, that, or the other quotation from Marx or Engels or Lenin, especially when they are highly selective quotations, proves nothing whatsoever. For every quotation that Ernest Mandel can advance to prove A, I could produce another one to prove B, but I don't intend to do so because it doesn't help us. The question of whether, in regard to perspectives for Western Europe, the program advanced by Kautsky in 1919, 1920 was superior or inferior to that of insurrection and Soviet power advanced by the Communist International at the time is an important question for historians. But it's not the problem that we're debating here this evening. The problem that we're debating here this evening is whether in 1977 a program of Soviets and insurrection is the kind of program that stands the slightest chance of advancing Western Europe to the aim of socialism that we all share. And firstly, as I've said, it seems to me to be significant, to put it no higher, that for that type of program advanced by the Fourth International, there has been no substantial support of any kind from the masses of the working people, whereas the kind of perspectives advanced by the communist parties in France and Italy in particular have got substantial support from such sections of the people as make it possible to go ahead and implement them. Now let's look at what these programs, these strategies, this perspective involves. Above all, it involves the recognition that capitalist power in Western European countries, unlike the position in Russia before the October Revolution, rests not primarily on force and coercion, but rests primarily on consent, on what Gramsci called the ideological hegemony of the bourgeoisie. And that, above all, it is a question of the communist parties in unity with other sections of the labor movement to be able to counterpose to that hegemony of capitalist ideas a socialist alternative which is not obtained only by propaganda, but on the basis of involving in action the working class in transforming the structures and in playing an ever increasingly hegemonic or leading role in the state in order that one can wage, in fact, a battle which, as Gramsci recognized, will be a protracted battle, unlike the frontal attack dictated by the conditions in the Soviet Union, a battle spread over the years in which more and more the working class and its allies become conscious of their strength to challenge the domination of capital, to control production, to control the economy, to democratize the state apparatus until the people of the country are drawn along to finally make the transformation to socialism, seen not as one act but as in fact a process of struggle. This is a fully democratic conception of struggle, and in fact the very democratic nature the conception that one only goes to the extent that one carries the majority of the people along with one, the conception that it is necessary to win the conviction of the majority of the people at every stage, is the only guarantee that the socialist regime that arises from out of these struggles will be a thoroughly democratic regime and will avoid the distortions that you had, the abuses and the crimes that grew up in the Soviet Union under Stalin. And it's not enough for our Trotskyist comrades to tell us Soviets, workers' councils will ensure such democracy. Because unfortunately they didn't in Russia, you know. The Stalin regime grew out of the Soviets, which is not an argument against Soviets. It is an argument about being so stupid as to believe that Soviets or any other institutional form can in itself guarantee against that type of bureaucratization if other conditions don't prevail, and above all, if you don't have the democratic consent of the population, if you don't have the democratic control of the population over their government, and if you don't allow other political organizations, including political organizations, to have freedom for propaganda and activity to control and, if necessary, to remove the government in their countries. And this is the conclusion that the Western communist parties have drawn some time ago on the basis of the Soviet experience. And incidentally, for our countries, the Soviet model, which represented such a great and important advance for Russia, would not by any means necessarily represent a higher form of democracy. In the document that the Fourth International has got out on the question of the dictatorship of the proletariat and democracy, there are a whole mass of contradictions. On the one hand, we are told that they are in favor of direct democracy. On the other side, we are told that they are in favor of a Soviet system of workers' councils, that is to say, going up to the level of a national congress of workers' councils. What is the essence of this? As in Russia, it is indirect election. The workers in a given area elect their delegates to the next area up, and they elect theirs, and so on. This is the essence of the system. Now, they try to get out of it, and perhaps Comrade Mandel will explain to us how, in fact, it works, by producing, in this particular document, a total hybrid. They tell us that the workers' councils that they envisage will not, in fact, only be councils of workers, but they will also give the opportunity for neighbourhood representation as well. Well, how, in fact, you merge Soviets with neighbourhood representation, which is basically the basis of representation of a parliamentary system, I do not know. But as far as we are concerned, it is necessary to do two things. On the one hand, it is necessary to preserve the forms of direct representation that have been won by the struggle of the people for the election of a parliament which can be where you have your own MP who you can control and so on. Secondly, it is, yes, and this is in fact where so many of the ultra left, if you like it, or Trotskyists and others go wrong. They generalize from the situation that exists under capitalism. They think that because under bourgeois democracy you have MPs who are out of control of the people, isolated from the people and removed from the people, that this means that Parliament will always be like that. They are confusing the form with the essence. They are confusing the form with the substance of the matter. The fact that if you have got, and this is the second point which I am putting, we posit such a parliamentary majority as being coupled with mass struggle of the working people at every level throughout the country, in the factories, in the offices, in the universities, in the localities, independent organizations of women, independent organizations of black people in countries like this, neighborhood communities, neighborhood organizations, community associations, and so on, which will in fact develop forms of direct democracy which will bring pressure to bear on the elected representatives of the people in the councils and and in Parliament. In other words, to ensure that the democratic shell that has been won by the working people under capitalism, in fact, is made responsive to the wishes of an increasingly activized population in a country where the industry is more and more brought under the ownership and control of the working people. This is the kind of perspective that we have. Now, the way in which the policy of the Communist parties is represented, and I've only got 5 minutes more, so I won't be able to deal with it in detail, some of the other comrades will, is as though, for instance, the Italian communists were aiming at a pure parliamentary or governmental bloc with Christian democracy in the worst type of social democratic coalition tradition. If you read the documents of the Italian Communist Party, you will find that what is envisaged, in fact, in the whole conception of the historic compromise, is a dynamic concept which will, in fact, ensure that the whole character of government is changed and the whole character of the Christian Democratic Party itself is changed under the pressure of the population. You find this extremely funny because you accept the accomplished fact, you accept a position that the present leaders who are denounced by the Italian Communist Party as being representatives of the monopolies will continue in a country where millions upon millions of Catholic workers and peasants support the Christian Democratic Party and are in a position, in fact, to influence as they move to the left, under the influence of socialist and communist ideas and leadership, influence that party and push it on a program which is forced to take measures which will mean that the old reactionary leaders are pushed out, and more the whole role of that party is transformed. Marxists have never had, and Lenin stressed this in left-wing communism, any objection in principle against alliances with bourgeois parties. Lenin stressed the Bolsheviks had also had such. I've got here, if anybody objected, I'll read the passage concerned. The point is the conditions under which such alliances take place. In Britain, there is no question of such an alliance. The Labour movement is strong enough to be able to push the Labour Party, its traditional organisation, to the left and secure left Labour governments which are able to carry the country along the road to a socialist transformation. This is our perspective as we outline it in the British Road. In France, there is no need to have a coalition with a major party of the bourgeoisie because the workers' parties, allied with the middle-class left radicals who don't actually count for a great deal, will be able to win a majority on a more advanced programme of social transformation for the country. But in Italy, after 20 years, 25 years or more of Christian democratic government, it was clear that it was not possible by the old perspective to succeed in moving things. Therefore, in fact, it was a question of advancing a programme which could break the control, the monopoly of the Christian Democratic Party, and help to set in train forces that would help to transform that Christian Democratic Party itself. The whole question of alliance with bourgeois parties is dependent on the programme and direction, and it will be decided by the dynamism of the struggle. In conclusion, comrades, if you believe, as the Trotskyists do, that the Western European communist parties, like in France and Italy in particular, are compromising with capitalism and selling out, you have to explain why the highly intelligent and extremely class-conscious representatives of American imperialism, such as Dr. Kissinger, and now the Carter administration itself, has made its utter fear, revulsion and objection public against the inclusion of communists in governments in these countries. And they have made it clear that their opposition is not because these parties are identified with Russia, because they recognize that they are not, but because of the danger that they represent to American imperialism in terms of the social transformations that would be carried out in the period ahead, in the perspective in these countries. So try, comrades, from the point of view of socialism, to be as class-conscious and as perceptive as Kissinger and the Carter administration are class-conscious and perceptive for their class.